Welcome to another live stream session today. I'm happy to kick off our live streaming every week and very excited for today's session. I have a very special guest and very important topic that we are going to talk about today. Today, we are going to talk about total cost management and how total cost management practices help us with improving our project performance on a consistent basis. Also, you are going to explore how cost engineers add tremendous value to the projects and the project team. So, these are kind of the main topics that we are going to talk about, and that's going to be a very informative session today. Now, if you are here joining us live, please, if you haven't done so already, go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, from which country you are tuning in, and if you're a cost engineer or not. So a big shout out to all cost engineers in the house who are joining us here. So hopefully that also shows the value of your work and kind of increase awareness on what you do for the projects. And also, now that you know a little bit about the topic and what we are going to talk about, also let us know what you are planning on learning today, or if you have any specific questions about the topic, please keep them coming so we can inject them throughout the conversation. And about myself, I am Shohreh Ghorbani. I'm the founder and technical director of Project Control Academy, which is the leading global provider of online training programs in project controls. And today I have the honor of introducing a fantastic guest, which I'm very excited and honored to introduce. And I'm very happy that he accepted my invitation for this LinkedIn Live session. As soon as I said, he said, yes, let's go for it. So special thanks to him for accepting this. And very excited to cover this important topic of total cost management. About my special guest today, he is bringing over 40 years of experience in project engineering, management, and consulting, primarily in the energy industry. He's been a former project manager at Chevron, and he supported more than 100 large and small projects globally worth over $100 billion. He's also the recipient of numerous awards, such as the Chevron Chairman Award for implementing value engineering throughout the corporation. He also is the recipient of Pathfinder's Award for outstanding contribution to the advancement of project management technology. He's also the recipient of AEC's Educational Service Award. So you have a great treat today, a special guest that I'm very honored to have, and you're going to learn a ton from him. He's also published and presented at many, many conferences. So if you've been into conferences, pretty much I'm sure you have heard him and very inspired by his message. So please help me give a big warm welcome to Dr. Nick Lavingia to this virtual stage. Let me have him here come on board and introduce himself to you. Dr. Nick, thank you so much for joining us on this live session.
Well, thank you, Shohreh, and good morning, everybody, or good day, wherever you're from. Um, my name is Nick Lavingia. I retired from Chevron, but what I'm going to share with you today, although I worked at Chevron, I was very fortunate to work with joint venture projects with ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, ConocoPhillips, Total, etc. So really what I'm going to share with you today are industry best practices in total cost management. So with that, Shohreh, let's just put up the slide and get into it.
Fantastic. Sure. Before we go there, if you don't mind, we would like to greet some of our audience here. I see Delgia is joining us here, as well as Mahmoud from UAE, Dick from Peru, Jose from Peru. If I can read the names right. Perhaps I better to show them here. Abu Kar from I don't know, KSA. We have a lot of people joining us. We have Aman from India. We also have Mehrdad from Iran. So thank you everyone for joining us. And I'm sorry if I missed your name here, but we have a lot of global representative every time. So thank you so much for joining us and introducing yourself here. So this session is for you to add value for you. And so please have your questions coming and ask any questions as we start the conversation. So as Dr. Nick mentioned, so let's get started into the conversation and start by addressing about the total cost management. So to kick off the conversation, Nick, I would like to know your definition of total cost management, because when it comes to total cost management, there are different definitions in different places. So what is your definition of that?
Really, if you will, once we get into the slide, you will see that the total cost management, ultimately everything comes back to money, right? In a business world, although you talk about cost, procurement, contracting, all the different topics on a project, uh, resources, I mean, everything comes back to ultimately money. And how does that impact the economics of a project? So what I'm going to share with the group today is what can, as a cost engineer, the value we can add on any project. And as you will see here, we have a major role to play on any undertaking throughout the life cycle of a project.
Fantastic. So let's get into the meat of the discussion. I know you have a great framework that you would like to share with us. So I'm not sure if it's showing on the screen. Let's see. Okay, let me share the slides again and make sure it's projecting properly for everyone. Give us a second. So, okay. Yeah, for some reason I lost the slide, but okay. So perhaps if we can continue the conversation, Nick, about total cost management and what you're planning to cover in today's session. And in the meantime, I will pull the slides that you have for the
Okay.
conversation.
All right. We'll do that. Sure. So let me just kind of cover the topics we're going to discuss in this half-hour session. And again, like to make it very interactive. Goal is not to be a one-sided presentation. So really, if you look at total cost management throughout the life cycle of a project, we really begin to kick off with economic analysis. So when you take a project to the executives in your company, what are they looking for? Tell me the bottom line, correct? Show me the money, as we say. So that'll be a topic we'll get into, economic analysis. In order, then we get into cost estimating, talk about how do we come up with an early estimate on a project. I'm sure you had a boss who comes and say, give me a quick number by lunchtime. So we got to be very careful how we discuss that number. That number could have very high contingency and a wide accuracy. So again, discussing cost estimating. Then we get into planning and scheduling, which includes, so here is the slide. Can we, I guess, Shohreh, go a full screen, or is this good? Can everybody see
sure.
this?
I will remove the chat so we can
All
go.
right then. Perfect.
Here you go. Yeah.
Okay. So as we say, you look at a kind of a 5-phase structured project development execution process. Phase 1 is identify and assess a business opportunity. So this is where some business people come up with an opportunity. And if it looks viable, the project will get into phase 2, where we select from the alternatives. And the alternative, by the way, after looking at a quick analysis in phase 1, could be do nothing, could be an option. Build a new facility, expand an existing facility, could be acquisition, a merger, could be divestiture, get out of business, maybe the right answer. And the goal is by the end of phase 2, you want a selected alternative. And once you've done that, Shohreh, could you just leave the slide on, please? I think they can see me. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. So at the end of phase 2, you selected an alternative. Then in phase 3, you want to develop the preferred alternative for full funding. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, it says FID. This is final investment decision. So really, this would be phase 1, 2, and 3 are kind of like the front end planning for any opportunity. And at the end of phase 3 is where you're committing big bucks. So phase 1, 2, and 3 may take 5 to 10% of the project cost, but starting phase 4 is where the bulk of the money is spent, which is the execution phase, detail engineering, procurement, construction. And at the end of phase 4, you turn over an operable asset to the operating organization in phase 5. So what can we as cost engineers contribute on this life cycle? Start with economic analysis. We do net present value, rate of return, payout. Those are kind of things the management is looking for. By the end of phase 3, you're done. We'll find out the outcome in phase 5 down the road. Then we get into cost estimating. You have conceptual estimate in phase 1. As I mentioned earlier, this could be the one with high contingency, wide accuracy in the beginning. But by the end of phase 3, the expectation in a lot of the companies is a funding estimate which is within plus or minus 10% accuracy. So if you had a $100 million project, up to 110 million, you do not need additional approval. So that's kind of like the best we can do by the end of phase 3. And typically in a facilities type projects, you've done 25, 30% of engineering at that point in time. In phase 4, we have a definitive estimate for a long duration project, and phase 5, cost collection and analysis. Then we get into planning and scheduling. You have a milestone schedule in phase 1, a critical path method bar chart schedule in phase 2, but by the end of phase 3, we're on a critical path method resource loaded schedule for all the resources in phase 4, not just the engineering resources, but all the construction craft in the field also. And of course, you're going to monitor and update as you go along in phase 4. Benchmarking. We are trying to build industry competitive projects. So typically in phase 1, you would have a cost capacity curve, which is kind of data scatter of all the data, whether they're internal to your company or from the industry. In a lot of projects, you can actually buy data from the industry, and that's a good way to see are we really building industry competitive projects. Set paid set of targets in phase 2, because if you're better than average company with an organized process like we are discussing, you should be able to do better than industry average. Come up with a pre-funding assessment in phase 3. This is one you can do internally in your company, or there are companies like we call independent project analysis out of Virginia, which has 10,000 projects in the database, and they actually come back and independently assess how well you've defined your project and ready to go into execution phase. And then we do post-project assessment in phase 5. How did we do compared to what we said we are going to do at the end of phase 3 in the final investment decision document? Then we get into contracting procurement. You have a strategy in phase 2, pre-qualification of contractors and suppliers in phase 3, and award and monitor in phase 4 and do a closeout. Then we get into performance measurement. Establish progress payments. For a lump sum project, you want to be able to track what the physical progress is compared to what was planned, and do earned value calculations in phase 4. Not just the hours spent, but what has physically been accomplished for the hours or dollars spent. Cost control and forecasting. We start with the work breakdown structure in phase 2, establish cost accounts and budgets in phase 3, and trend and forecast, not accounting, forecast in phase 4. And we have progress reporting that starts in phase 2 and continues throughout the project. And finally, at the end of the project, you do finance and audit. This is where capital money, which is spent, has to be amortized over the life of the project. But if you have any expense money, like maintenance money, dismantling on a revamp project, that money can be expensed the year it is spent. So you want to do asset accounting in phase 5. So, with that at a high level, let's open up to dialogue and see what everybody in the industry is doing. This is, as I said, based on my experience in the industry, talking to multiple companies. And since retiring from Chevron, I've trained over 10,000 people in the industry worldwide. So, really kind of bring up what are your thoughts and your challenges in this topic.
Fantastic, Dr. Nick. Thank you so much for covering that in kind of very short amount of time. A lot of great information was shared in that framework. Just a couple of questions before the audience come with their questions on this framework. Can you elaborate more on the phases that you've mentioned for the total cost management practice? So the phases, are they aligned with the project lifecycle, or it's the phases of development when we were involved in the total cost management process?
So this is the framework is the project development and execution process. So as I mentioned again, this is how a typical project advances. It starts with the business objective in phase one. Somebody in the business says, "Hey, let's do something." In phase two, what we want to do is look for creative alternatives, because sometimes what sounds good, very on a quick jerk or de-jerk reaction, may not even be a good project to go forward. So I call it, if you remember the good old days, I used to call it, we used to do project management, used to be ready, fire, aim. We used to jump into execution right away. And then we found out, gee, we made lots of changes in phase four. And I'm sure a lot of us can relate to that because we didn't do good planning. And what has happened with this process at Chevron and in the industry, this was implemented back in 1990s. And I was involved in it from the beginning. And what it did is by slowing down, in fact, by planning upfront and executing the project, the overall life cycle of the project actually got reduced. And what is really amazing is, as I say, we can have a cake and eat it too. Our projects became safer. They became better because our customer at the end was happy. They became faster overall life cycle and became cost efficient. So really, we achieved all that by following a structured process.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Nick. And one more thing. So you covered pretty much all within project controls in the total cost management practice that you've shared, including planning, scheduling. So my question is, planning, scheduling, you categorize that under cost as well. Can you clarify that a bit? Why planning, scheduling is also considered as the total umbrella of total cost management?
Okay, great question. So let's talk about it. If a project gets delayed by 6 months, what's going to happen to the cost?
Of course, it will have an impact on the cost.
And so these are the implications of cost and schedule, right? So having a critical path, a resource loaded schedule, and I'm sure we all have gone through that, resource constraints, you never have enough resources at the right people at the right time, and the implications it can have on the project cost. And a lot of times we say, well, the project team, if a project team is going to be from owner or a contractor side, if the schedule gets extended by a few months, guess what? The cost is going to be impacted. So every single topic I talked about has an impact on cost. So that's why the word total cost management. Similar with contracting procurement, right? If your contract is not well defined, let's say lump sum contract, and you have a lot of change orders, well, what's that going to do? It's going to impact not only cost, but schedule, which ultimately comes back to cost.
Okay. And for those of us in project controls, we are all quite familiar with the TCM framework from AAC International, Total Cost Management Framework.
Right.
Is it aligned with the TCM framework, or is it something coming based on your own practice, Nick?
This is very well aligned. In fact, I've had this slide presentation at AACE conferences since the 1990s.
Okay.
So it's very well aligned. And what I've really done is put it back in the form of how we apply TCM to projects.
Got it.
Right?
Okay.
Bringing it into how can we, because typically cost engineers, they feel like they're in phase 3 and 4, maybe just get the estimate, do the control. But we have a lot bigger influence on a project.
Fantastic. So let me go through some of the questions from the audience, and
Sure.
you see that already on the screen by Elias. So the question is, if a schedule is not resource or cost loaded, what are other alternatives to measure performance?
Now, a great, the benchmarking company I referred to, Independent Project Analysis, by the end of phase three, if you do not have a resource loaded schedule, they will give you a very bad score. And in a company, a lot of the companies I work with, the management will not approve a project to go forward, period. You're not ready to execute. So I think we need that discipline because there is no way I can give them a plus or minus 10% quality estimate at the end of phase three if I have not got a resource loaded schedule. So then to measure earned value is very difficult, right? Because you really don't know what you're measuring against.
So basically, you are saying, Nick, that we need to have resource loaded schedule pretty much for every project to be able to have the performance measured and earned value measured accordingly, right? So that's the
Exactly.
best
Because
practice you are recommending.
so remember, earned value, what we're going to be talking about. Let's say you had 100 hours budgeted for an activity. You're halfway done and you spent 75 hours. Now you can do earned value. But if you don't have a resource loaded schedule, you have no benchmark to compare.
That's a good point. And to be honest, what I have seen people are doing, they do earn value, but not off a resource loaded schedule or not aligned with the resource loaded schedule. So
Yeah,
that's why, and we know all EVM has some disadvantages when it comes to schedule performance. So if we don't integrate the cost and schedule together properly, then the EVM scheduling metrics are not going to work properly. So I hear you when you are saying it's important to also have a benchmark to make sure when EVM is showing
right.
us bad schedule performance, we have something to go against and check that out.
That's right.
So, and usually these two are not aligned, and the cost might be accurate, but on the schedule side, at least based on my own experience, might not be that accurate.
Right. And
Okay.
interesting, Shohreh, just to add to it, I've looked at projects where they start with a negative float.
Yeah,
So you know you're in trouble, right? And guess
that's
what? Things
right.
are not going to get better. If anything, things are going to get worse down the road. So these
Fantastic.
are kind of things I look for as a project manager. I never, by the way, ask a contractor what kind of tools they use. To me, tools are good, but I want to know what are the fundamentals that are in there. And just want to give you another good example on earned value. I expect earned value during for each engineering discipline, not an overall S curve, because overall doesn't tell you where the problem is going to be.
Mhm.
And for construction in the field, I want a S curve, earned value curve for each construction craft in the field. That's the only way you're going to know where the problem is.
That's exactly right. So you can
So,
dig
so give you
down
a
and
good
go.
example. Let's say if the construction, if somebody, a contractor gives you an overall S curve, the civil contractor is behind schedule, but mechanical, electrical people are going proceeding ahead. Overall S curve may look good, but guess what's going to be the problem? If civil contractor is delayed, everything else is delayed. You see
Exactly.
what I'm saying? So I demand that whether it's a reimbursable or a lump sum contract, I demand that I want an S curve by engineering discipline early in the process and construction craft in the field.
Okay, that's you're a good project manager, so no doubt about it, Nick.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have another question here on the phases that we discussed by Vikram. So he's a
Uh-huh.
civil engineer, and he said that he's just aware about another phase six, which is refinancing of operational facility. Can this be covered under this total cost management umbrella and framework that you just covered? Kind of adding another phase to your phases.
Refinancing of operational facility. I'm trying to understand that, but the way the phase five, the way I've defined is you take the current project that is completed at the end of phase four, and then in phase five, you're saying, okay, what are the lessons learned? What went well? What can we do better next time for similar project? And so now refinancing, I'm not quite sure how that fits in here. But the goal here, and one other thing I may just add in Chevron, the things we added was that every project, phase one gate, a sponsor is assigned, and that sponsor stays on the project throughout the project. The key planning in phase two, project manager, engineering manager, construction manager, they stay on the job throughout the project, including operations rep, the one who's going to inherit the asset. Because guess what? They are the people who are going to live with what we build for the next 20, 30 years. So the goal is to have that integrated team who stays throughout the project. And then we do a look back on all the projects 1 to 2 years after it is up and running. And so let's say you can build a project safely, on time, on budget, but it does not deliver business results because you built cheap equipment. You eliminated spare equipment, so things are falling apart. So the sponsor is held accountable for the business outcome down the road. And this is where we build the accountability model in the system. And as a project manager, the most I ever learned, by the way, on my project was when I stayed on the project 6 months after it was done to find out from operations the things that went well and things that we really missed or could have been done better. That's the kind of lessons learned we want to take on to future projects.
And
as a project management consultant at Chevron, that's the kind of lessons learned I took over when I facilitated future projects.
And I really like the fact that you mentioned about lesson learned. And I noticed in your framework, you also had benchmarking. So we usually don't do a good job in benchmarking. We don't go back and review what has been done well and how we can use the data from our project moving forward, utilize for other projects. How did you make sure that benchmarking is implemented well in your projects that you've been managing?
Yeah. So this is, as I mentioned in our company, one of the requirements we had was each project had to go through this company called Independent Project Analysis. Okay. And they actually told you what, in phase one, they told you what the typical cost capacity curve for that type of project would be. And for different parts of the world, by the way. We had US, Europe, Middle East, Africa, you name countries, we worked around the world. And so we started with that benchmark. And then we said, okay, we want to, if we have a good process, good organization structure, a world-class project management system, we ought to be able to do better than the benchmark. But the goal was not to be so optimistic or so pessimistic. And the point was this separate independent company benchmarked each project. And they came back with what an industry competitive costs and schedule should be.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that explanation. So hopefully we can do all a better job in benchmarking our projects and using the data that we have in our projects moving forward. So I will go to the next question we got from Sayed Ali. So can you explain why the progress reporting is written separate than performance measurement? And he thinks that progress reporting should start from phase 3 in your framework. Can you share your thoughts? And let me share the framework again for everyone who are just joining us, so everyone gets a better idea here.
Yeah, a great question. The progress reporting encompasses everything. And the reason we start in phase 2 is you really need to establish what your expectations are, because we typically will have contractors involved in phase 2 in some cases to help us out to plan the project. So we're measuring their progress, we're measuring their cost and schedule, and that has to be reported to management because each phase has got a budget assigned to it. So only way we are going to know where we are for phase 2. Now, granted, phase 3 is going to be like more contractors involved. You might even have some key suppliers engaged on a major project. So the goal is to start reporting progress from the beginning. And the way the system works, at least in the US, is all the work that's done in phase 1 and 2 can be expensed for tax purposes. Whereas starting phase 3, the money has to be capitalized, which means then it's to be amortized over the life of the project. So we have to keep the books clear. And a lot of times, by the way, projects go through phase 2 and get canceled because what sounded like a good idea turned out to be not that great. And then we'll just cancel the project. And that money can be expensed off. So That's the reason we start in phase two, but it continues throughout.
And for clarity for everyone in the audience, what is exactly phase two? What do you mean by selecting from alternatives here?
So phase two is the one where we really look at all the things. Like what may sounded like a great idea in phase one, could you do a little more analysis? Like typically phase one is you've done about 1% engineering. In phase two, you might do up to 5% engineering. And when you find out what sounded like a great idea in phase one turns out to be a non-starter in phase two, which means you cancel the project. Or you decide, hey, instead of building new facility, why don't we acquire a company? Like if you look at the energy industry, Exxon acquired Mobil, BP acquired Amoco and Arco, Chevron acquired Texaco and Unocal. And the reason was they found it was better to acquire than to build that capacity themselves. It was going to be cheaper to acquire and get additional capacity compared to building their own. So in phase two, mergers, acquisition, divestiture. We have had projects, we have actually divested part of the company because after looking at the alternatives, we say, hey, this is not for us. Maybe give it to somebody else who is good at that.
So is it from the owner perspective? Let's say I'm a contractor and I'm getting the job, and so phase one, perhaps, is it just, I just want to have clarity, is it from the owner's perspective, the
Right.
phases that you have mentioned, or I want to see when the contract is awarded and the project is started, from which phase I can correlate that with those phases?
Okay, great question. So phase one is typically business driven. So it's by the owner. Starting phase two, the contractors do get involved supporting the owner. But really, phase one and two are more the owner side, right? Making a good decision. And that's the idea, to create value. What you want to do, if you select the wrong alternative in phase two and execute that with excellence, that's not a great idea, right? Building a wrong project less expensively is not much help, as I say. So the goal is phase one and two are more on the owner side. Starting phase through, the contractor gets involved. And I think the contractor needs to be engaged into the buying of the project. They need to understand what the business drivers are. The contractor needs to understand a project or a schedule driven project, quality. So they need to know these drivers so that they can recommend good alternatives based on their experience working with a lot of other owners.
Very well said, Nick. Thank you
Right?
so much for clarifying the phases for us and what's
Yeah.
covered in each of those phases. I appreciate that, Nick. So let me move on to the next question we have here. So we have a question by Omer, and the question is, how do you handle inflation during the cost planning and estimating phase, especially inflation now after the COVID has been skyrocketing in most countries, and escalation as well. So what is your advice in regards to handling that during the cost planning and estimation phase?
A great question. So what we do again, in a company like Chevron, you have got people who are tracking world business around, what's going on. And so what they would do is the business people give us what the escalation we should use. So if it's a 5-year project, they may say, hey, use escalation of X% each year, right? So we would use that. That is built in as a separate line item on the cost estimate. And same thing, by the way, I need to bring up here. A lot of projects, pretty much every project has rework, right? We know based on past experience, there is always rework on a project. So to me, a rework is also a separate line item on a cost estimate. All these things should be very transparent in your cost estimate. The things like, what is your base allowances on the estimate? What is the contingency for? So allowances for foreseeable stuff, a contingency is for unforeseeable. And then we need to be very transparent with management, telling them all the risk mitigation that you have implemented on your project and the risk that you have not mitigated. For example, political risk. When price of steel used to go like crazy, those good old days. So what we would do is we'll tell a contractor, let's say price of steel is based on $100 a ton. If it goes to 120, the owner will pay the difference. If it goes to 90, we want the credit, right? So again, be very transparent in your cost estimate. And what the management wants on any company is they don't want surprises, right? Because it's more than that. It's a capital stewardship. They're planning hundreds of projects around the world. They've got limited budget. So when one project has a big overrun, guess what happens to the projects coming down the road? They get canceled. And so very critical that we as project managers, and especially cost engineers, be very upfront. So give you a good example. We had a project where we're going to implement a new technology. So we actually said, hey, the startup schedule could be maybe plus 6 months. We'll have debugging issues coming up based on, again, industry benchmark from that company IPA. So we put that in our schedule. So the estimate then reflected that schedule.
Okay, fantastic. Very well said. Thank you for bringing a lot of experience in the projects you had and the practicality of it into the conversation. Thank you, Nick. So now following this question on the estimate and escalation, we have also, let me see the question again. We have also a question related to that by here you go, by Marcella. So how can you mitigate if we have not done a good job right off the bat, like with having a good estimate at the beginning? So as you know, if our target are not right, no matter how good of a job we do on earned value, on performance, on planning, scheduling, nothing is going to work. So we are always going to run behind. So, and one of those major drivers is the cost estimate. So how do you mitigate if you know that the cost estimate that you started the job with kind of was not right?
Well, this is a really interesting question because when we started the journey in Chevron, and you'll be really amazed that a third of our projects used to have major cost overruns, right? And by the way, just to let people know, our capital budget used to be $40 billion a year. So you're talking big bucks, all right? And the point was, we started a training program and our CEO was our first student. So, and it was an extensive certification process, up to 40 hours. And the CEO got certified. And then, of course, once he got certified, the next group is we call the Nifty 50, the 50 people below him. We had 2 sessions of 25 people each, certified them. When I retired in Chevron, we had trained more than 5,000 people in the company worldwide, including every business unit, plant manager, operations, maintenance, technical managers were trained. And they understood that, hey, if we don't have a good estimate, we don't have the right resources, the project should not move forward, period. So there was no such thing as going to earn value when you don't have a good estimate or a good schedule. You're just wasting your time.
So in that case, Nick, let's say you're already working on a project and then in the middle, you know that, oh, you forgot to estimate some major elements and the estimate is not right. So how do you justify the estimate? Do you again, is there any mitigation strategies around that?
Well, the mitigation would be, let's say, and there are some projects where things have happened. And that's why if you look at my chart, it showed definitive estimate in phase 4. So you could have some real dramatic thing happen in the industry, right? COVID hit, big inflation, and you do a definitive estimate. And I tell you, I know of a project in Canada, which was multi-billion, got canceled in phase 4 because the cost definitive estimate came out way off. Right? So it can happen, but the goal is if you've done good planning, chances of that happening are typically projects get canceled in phase 2 and maybe 3. But really, if you've done a good job of planning, the phase 4 should be, if you're within plus or minus 10%, the project is considered a success. And remember, we do the economic analysis at what we call a P10, P50, P90 probabilities. So which would encompass plus or minus 10% estimate. And also, by the way, plus or minus 10% on the schedule. So we talked schedule contingency also, not just cost contingency. Exactly. So if you had a 2-year project and you can say you can do it in 20 months, and it might take 26 months. That would be in the economic analysis. Same thing with the cost. So we do a P10, P50, P90 economic analysis. So everything was reported to management on P10, P50, P90. And so if the project came anywhere within that 80% confidence interval, it was considered a success.
So with that, did you run risk analysis in the major projects? So you knew
Every
your
project
P.
required cost and schedule risk assessment.
And was there any size of the project that required the risk analysis to be done, or pretty much on all the projects you
In
did
fact,
that?
these tools nowadays you get, you can apply them for anything over $5 million, right?
So that's your recommendation, another thing to run the QRA on projects.
It is required. There is no, in fact, in our company, every project had to go in that end of phase 3 final investment decision, had to have a cost schedule risk assessment,
Love it.
had to have the economic analysis at P10, P50, P90, had to have a risk register, the risk that project team has mitigated, and the risk that they have not mitigated, equally important. And
But
telling
at
management,
stage
hey, this is the
2,
risk that you, the big guys making the big decisions, they are the ones responsible for.
so basically major decision points at stage 3 before going to the execution. So that was
Exactly.
definitely a need. But perhaps for phase 1 and 2 kind of was loose. So you didn't need that
Well,
much at the
in
beginning.
phase 2 we would still do for major project, do a QRA, end of phase 2 gate
Okay.
for the preferred alternative.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying
And
on that.
remember the S curves, the P10, P50, P90 would be wider in phase 2 compared to phase 3 because you got more
Of
definition,
course,
right?
definitely.
So
The ranges would be wider. Yes,
so what you will see is your contingency goes down from phase 1 to 2 to 3. Your accuracy gets better.
definitely. And I'm
Right.
glad that you brought the ranges and the classifications of the estimate here,
Yeah.
because that's another important thing we need to consider when it
Right.
comes to
And
accuracy.
these are kind of things I think we cost engineers have a major role to play. Be very transparent. I know people don't like that, but ultimately we are there to add value and say it like it is.
Definitely. Very
Right.
well
And
said.
so we were very transparent, telling management and there were some new technology projects by even in end of phase 3, we could not get them plus or minus 10%. It was minus 10 plus 20 or plus 30 because of a new technology risk. So again, the S curve, the way it showed is, well, yeah, if you want to implement new technology, here are the risks.
Okay, great. So we have another question here by Raul. So, what is most recommended on an EPC to have procurement milestone or level of effort duration for a specific equipment? I think that's a very specific question. And I know always when it comes to procurement, it's hard to have kind of progress procurements easily. So perhaps if I can make it more general question. So what was your approach for an EPC type project when procurement is involved to measure progress and performance on the vendors that supply the procured items? So, because again, the procurement is always a tough, challenging one when it comes to earned value and performance measurement.
Right. So again, it's a great question. So like, we bought sometimes very expensive equipment like reactors and all. So what we would do is we'll say, okay, the day we sign a contract, we'd give them 10%. The reason is that contractor is going to go place a purchase order for exotic steel or something. So they need money. Then we'll say, okay, when we sign the purchase order, once they've done the front end work, so that's 10%. And then we put progress milestones. Once it is, and we, by the way, on major equipment, like a critical equipment, we actually will have inspectors going to their fabrication shop to measure how they're doing. All right. So there's some sort of a payment progress there because, they're spending a lot of money. So we'll set up that. And then when the equipment is delivered at site, they get certain percent. And then when it's accepted, which means it's running and things are working, they get the balance. So retention, 10% or so. So you have to establish those. And again, by the way, in my detailed sessions, I cover all this stuff. We have got detailed progress payment suggestions for all different kind of equipment. the reactors, tanks, compressors, pumps, electrical equipment, instrumentation. So again, that's getting into a lot of detail, but you can set that up front, and that is the progress payment. Regardless of what the contractor has spent, we're going to only pay them for meeting that milestone. So they
And
don't get paid just because they overextended budget or something.
And I really like the fact that you're saying for procurement, we need to align our kind of progress measurement with the payment milestones, and that's usually how it happens. But like you brought an example of some major equipment. So for other type of procured items, when you cannot send an inspector, what was the criteria for you to make sure that procured items that hit that milestone, it's okay to payment and it's okay to claim that progress? So. What was the requirement that you were asking from the vendors to provide you?
Okay. So one of the first things you got to remember, I didn't work in a government company. This was a private industry. We did not go for competitive bid on everything. Like, for example, engineered equipment, we had single source alliances. And when we formed the alliance, we had our inspectors go and check the factory, make sure that they really are as good quality as they claim, right? And then we always never went to competitive low cost. Quality was a requirement. And so you got to be careful how you do this, because you can save some money up front. And we are always looking for, and here again, cost engineers have a role to play, life cycle cost, right? Because I was with the company for more than 30 years. I was looking for projects that ran for a long, long time, right? So let's say we might actually spend a little more money on an energy or a compressor, which may be saving you energy for the next 20 or 30 years. So we might actually spend a little more capital up front. So let's say we went to 3 bidders and one bidder came in a little higher, but we will buy that. So I think there was trade-off. So that's why if you look at my analysis, I said cost efficient projects, not necessarily the lowest cost.
Okay, well said. Sorry, we are a bit going over time because we have a lot of great questions from the audience. Shall we keep going, Nick?
I'm okay. If people want to continue, I'm fine.
Fantastic. So let me go through the next question we have by Christian. So how do you approach the life cycle cost management as conception cost, 3 to 10%, has the most impact on the life cycle cost?
Yeah. So one of the practices we have is called reliability availability modeling. And what this does is so let's say if you have a spare equipment you're looking at, should we install it or not? So we look at what is the life cycle impact of that. So we look at mean time between failure, mean time to repair, capital costs, operating costs, maintenance costs, and bring it back to net present value for decision making. So the goal being, as we say very simply, in God we trust, everybody else bring data. So you got to have data. You just can't say my gut feel says let's do this. Is that answer the question?
I hope it does. I don't know if it's any follow-up question.
The goal being that the life cycle costs have to be part of the analysis, and especially from the owner's point of view. A contractor typically builds a project and then leaves by the end of phase 4, but owner is the one that's living with what we build for the next forever, right? So from an owner's point of view, and that's why, again, as I say, I'm a contractor who's looking for owner's interest, right? In the sense, I would say if a contractor comes to me and say, hey, listen, this may cost a little more, but based on our experience, it's going to give you better life cycle, better energy efficiency. That's the kind of contractor I want on my team. And I want them to be engaged from the beginning.
Okay, great.
There, by the way, on the projects I led, the contractors were involved in all the workshops for project execution planning. The key suppliers were also part of it. And a lot of the good ideas, by the way, came from the suppliers and contractors. Because guess what? They've done work with a lot of other owners. They know the business.
And what you mean when you mean what when you say sorry workshops? So what do you exactly mean? You said they were all part of a workshop. Was it the
So
training that they were part of, or you mean the
no, this is like
moving?
starting in phase two, because we
Okay,
leverage a lot of contractors for front end planning also. That we would have at the beginning of phase two a project execution planning kickoff,
okay,
right? Where we will tell the contractor as an owner, here are the owner's business objectives. We are cash driven, schedule driven, quality, whatever. Safety is a core value. We are never going to sacrifice safety for anything. And then, so they know what the business goals are. They are engaged in all the workshops, engaged in developing the schedule, engaged in developing the
right.
cost estimate, right? They know they are really, and then by the way, all the core member of the owner team, like project manager, engineering manager, construction manager, operations representative, the one who's going to inherit the asset, they are all in this workshop.
You mean to do the strategic planning for the project, right?
Correct. So this is starting in phase two, and
Yeah.
then again kick off phase three with the selected alternative, do another project execution planning workshop. So
Okay.
really, the
Beautiful.
contractors and key suppliers are part of the team.
And
And
that's great that you were involving them in the planning process upfront. That's great.
oh, absolutely, like even we will bring in from a contractor side the construction people in phase three. Sometimes even in phase two, because guess what? What may be easy to design may be difficult to build, right? So we want that. And we want operations people and maintenance people. Like when you may build something, but it may be very difficult to maintain down the road. So the key is starting phase two. People are engaged in selecting the right alternative, developing the alternative. And as I say, you pay me now or pay me a lot more later. And so the goal is make the changes early in the process. A change that may cost you $1 in phase two will cost you $10 in phase three, and $100 in phase four, and $1,000 in phase five after it is built, right? I
Yeah,
mean, it's an
definitely.
incremental number. So goal is get the right people at the right time. And I used to, by the way, facilitate a lot of what we call peer review workshops. And the project would not get past the phase two gate if we didn't have the right resources on the team. So if
And
an
I really,
operations person was not engaged in selecting the alternative, we are not going to go to phase three.
that's
Because
great.
guess
That's
what?
amazing.
Ultimately, he is going to come back to me, or he or she, and later and make changes after the plant is built. I don't
Yeah,
want that.
that's true. And getting
So
the team buy-ins is really great that you mentioned involving the entire team upfront at every gate, at every phase. So it's really important. So thanks for bringing those best practices in and which you already implemented in actual projects. So
and the nice thing was the sponsor used to be at a pretty good level. That as a project manager, I had issues with not having resources. All I had to do is go to the sponsor and
yeah.
say, hey, listen, if I don't have the right resources, I cannot move the project and give you the quality estimate you're looking for.
Okay. And going back to the earlier question about the life cycle cost, so the
Mhm.
follow-up clarity or the question by Christian is, so are you saying that we have to bring in all cost estimates to present value, basically engineering economics?
Yes,
So you run
absolutely.
engineering economics on projects too at the beginning, right?
Because that's how you can justify uh, something on a project. Like let's say, a lot of times tendencies those some of the equipment is pretty expensive, like a compressor costs $1 million. So people say, well, eliminate the spare equipment, save money. So we'll put that down. That if you do that, you wanted the plant to be running at 90% of the time. Guess what's going to happen? It's going to run maybe at 70% of the time, which means your economics are really going to be deteriorated, correct, on
Mhm.
the project. So that's how we say you justify the investment based on the net present value.
Okay. Thanks for
And
clarifying.
you're looking at mean time between failure, repair, all those some operating maintenance costs, bringing it all back for decision making.
Great. I think we have a lot of questions, but let me go for one more and then we can adjourn the session. It's a lot of interaction, a lot of discussion here, Nick. So the last question I can go here is by Sujal. And the question is, if there is no possibility to back off from the project and the contractor realized there would be a major loss, then what would be the reasonable recommendation to bring back the project at least break even?
Oh boy.
That's a tough one.
Well, this is where I think, as a project manager, when I worked with contractors, my goal was I want the contractors to be successful. It's got to be a win-win for both sides. If you make it a win-lose, ultimately long term, and remember, we were not required to go to the low bidder. We were required to. So my goal was, as soon as I got involved with a contractor, I said, listen, you have a problem, bring it to me. I'll give you a good example. I was working on a project in Los Angeles refinery, and the contractor had limited resources in Los Angeles. And the process engineers were falling behind schedule. So I went to the contractor and I say, hey, do you have people in Houston? Do you have people in San Francisco? They say, yeah. I said, bring them on. I will pay their per diem. I'll pay their airfare. They can go home every weekend. Because if they fell behind, the whole project was going to be held up, right? So having that open dialogue with the contractor, I know it cost me a little more money for engineering, but for the overall project, that was peanuts from the owner's point of view. Now, for a contractor, it was a hit, right? So having that open dialogue and working with the contractor, because the day contractor loses money, the owner is going to lose a lot more. Mm-hmm. Like some of our projects during shutdowns or turnarounds, like we have a refinery in Los Angeles. We take shutdowns in spring and fall. And you can imagine the gasoline demand picks up in summer right now. You know what's happening to gasoline prices and all. So we had a project that was getting delayed. I actually flew contractors from Tulsa who are good at doing this and paid them overtime and everything. Because for every day we were down is going to cost us $1 million, right? Wow. So you have to look at the business side and as an owner and contractor, work this out. And I never want, by the way, a contractor to go out of business, because the day that happens, we all as an industry lose.
Okay, very well said. Thank you, Nick. Perhaps there's one follow-up question I will ask that, and hopefully that's the last one. Sure. So, yeah. So, following again the previous discussion we had on the collaborative approach and involving everyone right upfront for the strategic planning. So, the question is: do you recommend this collaborative approach in contracting planning is more effective with EPC or cost plus contract?
The way, if you look at what I call the ideal contracting strategy or preferred, right? As an owner, the maximum value is with EPCM, engineering, procurement, construction management. Mm-hmm. So give you a good example. So we would starting in phase 2, and that contractor stays throughout the project, do engineering, procurement, and construction management on a reimbursable basis, but construction subcontracts on a lump sum. So once the project is well defined, do civil contract, mechanical, electrical, instrumentation on a lump sum. Because by then the project is very well defined and you give it to the contractor to good at doing, and then leave them alone. And the goal is, that's the critical. Do not make changes in phase 4. And maybe this is one thing I'll leave everybody with. When I was a project manager, no change happened in phase 4. There were 2 questions asked. Is it safe the way it is designed, and will it work? If the answer is yes, no change. No such thing as a great idea in the execution phase.
Wow.
I would say 9 out of 10 changes get killed because they answer those 2 questions. It's safe the way it is designed, it'll work.
Even if it saves you cost and money down the road?
Doesn't matter. Because every trivial change you're going to make is going to have a ripple effect on a lot of things, which are not easily seen. Like you might save a little money on a piece of equipment, but first of all, if you've done the right stuff up front, you wouldn't have to do that, right? I mean, the whole thing is coming back to planning. If you're planned well, you should not have surprises in phase four. Like people shouldn't come back, operations come back and say, oh, by the way, I need another piece of equipment because they'd signed off the key documents. And by the way, I had those people working on my like operations all sign off the documents in blood. I call it in key documents. So
Yeah,
they are responsible for making those decisions. So if they want to change in phase four, and this is, by the way, again, having a sponsor who is going to support you, saying, hey, it is safe and works, no change. If it's
fantastic.
not unsafe, you have to fix it. I mean, let's face it, that's something we can't tolerate that.
Okay, great discussion, Nick. Thank you so much for shedding a lot of light from your experience and also on total cost management best practices. So I really appreciate your time here. Special thanks to our audience for their engaging questions throughout the
Right? Yeah.
conversation that made us go half an hour more than we originally planned. So thank you everyone for your engagement, and people on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Thank you so much for being here live with us and asking a lot of great questions. You also had a question earlier on the phases, and can you explain those again? So all of that will be it's already recorded, will be placed on all these three channels, the social media channels, under Project Control Academy. So you can go back and check either YouTube or LinkedIn or Facebook. So that recorded version of it would be there. So if you missed some of this presentation and discussion, you can join back at any time and revisit the content. It will be there forever, so you can go and check back the content. So with that, before we adjourn the session, Nick, if people want to learn more about you or get in touch with you, how they can you give us some information on people who are interested in being in touch with you and how they can do that?
Sure, since I've retired, my goal is to give back and really help young people get into this business. So tell you, my email is very easy. My full name, nicklavingia@gmail.com. And feel free to send me a message and I'll be happy to respond. And if
So
people
kind
want
of
a
you.
copy of the slide or something, I'm happy to send it to them too.
Oh, fantastic. And you can definitely connect with Nick on LinkedIn. He's tagged already on this post, so you can find his
That's right.
profile and connect with him that way as well. Do you have a website or something that people can go to, or not
Yeah,
yet?
it's very simple, nicklavingia.com.
Fantastic. Awesome. Great.
Full name. Yeah. But the website is really, I mean, it's just very brief, but people
Okay.
can look at my resume, the background, but the best is just approach me. I'm
Okay.
available.
Fantastic. Awesome. I
I'm really
appreciate.
pretty much retired, but as I say, do provide, and I do a lot of webinars. So
Okay.
this may be of interest to some people. I can definitely send them some information on an entire
Fantastic.
project management, uh,
Yeah.
any topic.
Yeah, I've heard that ACE International, we've been a few weeks ago, your class was packed with people. So a lot of interest every time you present. So thank you, Nick, for again accepting this call and really being open to answering all the questions. We really appreciate your time here. Hopefully, we can have more of you for our Project Control community at Project Control Academy. So, but again, I appreciate your time. Special thanks to everyone who've been part of this live session. As you know, we keep doing this, and we've been doing the live streaming every week on Thursdays at 11 a.m. US Central Time. So stay tuned for next week for another informative session. Until then, I wish everyone all the best and do the best in everything you do in your projects. Thank you. Bye for now.